The village of Stonefang had never been much to look at. Tucked between two gray mountains in the eastern reaches of the Ashvale Highlands, it was a cluster of squat stone buildings, mud-packed rooftops, and cooking fires that burned low and smoky. The orc clans who lived there were not warriors of legend. They were farmers, mostly, mushroom growers, goat herders, traders who carried dried meat and iron tools down the mountain passes twice a year to sell to the human settlements below. Grukkar Stoneback had been born in Stonefang 34 years ago, delivered in the back room of a healer's hut during a snowstorm so fierce that his father, Balger, had not been able to reach the village until 3 days after the birth. By then, the baby had already survived the cold, survived a fever, and survived the healer's initial concern that he was too small to make it. Balger had looked at his son's gray-green fists, already curled tight and furious, and said, "This one will not go gently." He had been right, in ways neither of them could have predicted. Grukkar grew tall, not enormous, not the war-beast size of the southern orc clans who bred themselves for combat, but tall enough, broad across the shoulders, with a jaw like a cliff shelf and small amber eyes that caught firelight and held it, warm and steady. He was not beautiful by any measure, with his lower tusks that curved unevenly, the left one slightly longer, and the scar across his nose from a childhood fall into a stone wall. But there was something in his face that people trusted, something settled, something that said, "I am here, and I am not leaving." He had married Vrenna Coldstream when he was 22 and she was 20. She was from a clan 2 mountains over, a small woman by orc standards. With dark braids she kept wrapped in copper wire and a laugh like a rockslide, sudden, unstoppable, and somehow joyful in its chaos. She had come to Stonefang to trade her clan's woven blankets and had stayed because, as she told Grukkar later, "You were the first person who asked me what I thought about the weather instead of how much I was selling the blankets for." They built a life together the way orcs of Stonefang always did, slowly, practically, with their hands. They dug their house foundations deeper than required, because Vrenna believed in doing things past the point of necessity. They planted a mushroom garden in the hillside behind their home and learned, through 3 years of failure, how to coax the dark-capped stone blooms to grow fat and flavorful. They had a daughter, Misha, who inherited Vrenna's laugh and Grukkar's stubbornness, and a son, Doric, who inherited Vrenna's cleverness and Grukkar's tendency to sit quietly in corners and think too hard about things. For 12 years, Grukkar Stoneback was, by every measure he understood, a fortunate orc. Then the blight came. It started in the mushroom gardens, a gray fuzz that no one recognized, spreading from cap to stem overnight. By the time the village elders identified it as the ashrod, a fungal parasite that hadn't been seen in the highlands in 60 years, it had already spread through half the growing terraces on the southern slope. They burned what they could, salted the earth, prayed to the mountain spirits in the old way, with iron offerings and smoked cedar. It wasn't enough. The blight took the mushroom harvest. The mushroom harvest had been Stonefang's primary trade good for 3 generations. Without it, the autumn trading caravan carried almost nothing worth selling. The coin that came back was a fraction of what the village needed to carry through winter. Grukkar had savings. Most of it went into the village emergency fund, because that was what Stonefang families did. You poured yourself into the collective pot before you kept anything for your own bowl. He didn't resent it. He would have felt like a coward keeping it back. The winter was brutal. The goat herds, weakened by a dry summer, lost a third of their number to cold. The grain stores ran lower than anyone had projected. Rations became a nightly calculation at every table in the village. Grukkar learned to feel full on less. His children learned not to ask for seconds. In the spring, just when the worst seemed over, Vrenna got sick. It wasn't dramatic. It never is, when something real begins. She started coughing in late winter. Everyone assumed it was the cold, the dry air, the stress of the difficult months. But the cough didn't leave with the snow. It deepened, settled in her chest like something that had decided to stay. The village healer, old Marek, tried every remedy she had. Poultices, steam herbs, the bitter mountain teas that cost more than they could afford. Vrenna drank everything without complaint, told Grukkar she felt better when she didn't, and spent her good hours teaching Misha how to braid wire into copper flowers. She died on a morning in early summer when the sky was so blue it seemed unfair. Grukkar sat beside her for a long time after. long enough that Misha came to find him, took his enormous gray-green hand in her small one, and said nothing, which was exactly right. The years after Vrenna's death were the years Grukkar lost. Not lost like forgetting. He remembered everything with horrible clarity. He lost them the way you lose a road in fog. You're still moving, you're still putting one foot forward, but you have no idea where you are or whether it matters. He kept the house. He kept the mushroom garden, though the stone blooms never grew quite as well without Vrenna's particular touch. He raised Misha and Doric through their remaining childhood years with a kind of grim competence. They were fed, clothed, educated, loved in the ways he knew how to show it, which were mostly practical. He made sure they were warm. He fixed things when they broke. He showed up. But he was not present. Not really. Not in the way he had been when Vrenna was alive. He was a man going through the motions of being a man, and he knew it, and he didn't know how to fix it. Misha grew up and married a stonemason from the next valley when she was 20. The wedding was good. Grukkar smiled the whole day and cried for an hour alone afterward, sitting in the garden, not entirely sure whether he was happy or sad or something that didn't have a name. Doric grew up and left for the lowland cities when he was 18, hungry for the wider world in a way that Stonefang had never been able to satisfy. He wrote letters. Grukkar read them slowly, tracing his son's words with one thick finger, proud and hollow simultaneously. At 34, Grukkar Stoneback lived alone. He was not unhappy, exactly. He had his garden. He had his neighbors. He had Marek, the old healer, who had known him since birth and treated him with the particular affection reserved for people you have watched survive things they shouldn't have had to survive. He had the mountain, which did not ask anything of him and provided, in return, a kind of silent companionship he had grown to appreciate. He was not unhappy, but he was not alive, either, not in the full sense. He was a fire that had burned down to coals, still warm, still capable of heat, but no longer throwing light. That was the state of Grukkar Stoneback on the autumn evening when everything changed. The journey down the mountain was not Grukkar's idea. It was Marek's, old Marek, who was 70-something and had run out of patience for watching Grukkar slowly petrify. She had cornered him at the autumn market, between the goat cheese stall and the iron tools table, and told him plainly that the lowland trading settlement of Bracewater was looking for experienced mushroom growers to help establish a cultivation program, that they were paying well, and that Grukkar needed to go. "I don't need to go anywhere," Grukkar said. "You need to go somewhere," Marek said. "Anywhere. Somewhere that isn't inside your own head. My head is fine. Your head is a cave you've been living in for 6 years. Go to Bracewater. They're paying 2 silver a week, plus lodging. It's 4 months' work. Come back in the spring with some blood in your veins." He went, eventually, mostly because arguing with Marek was like arguing with the mountain. Technically possible, practically pointless. The road to Bracewater was 2 days' walk. Grukkar carried his tools in a canvas pack and walked steadily, stopping once at a way station to sleep on the common room floor with a collection of traveling merchants and 2 young human soldiers who stared at him with the particular combination of wariness and trying not to stare wariness that he was accustomed to from humans who hadn't spent much time around orcs. He didn't mind. He'd stopped minding years ago. People feared what they didn't know, and most of the people in the lowlands didn't know orcs except as shapes in old stories. Monstrous, violent, terrifying. He had learned to move slowly in human spaces, to keep his voice low, to smile carefully so his tusks didn't alarm anyone. It was tiring, sometimes, the constant management of other people's fear. But he understood it. He wasn't angry about it. Much. Bracewater was a market town that had grown up around an old river crossing. The kind of place that had been small for a long time, and then suddenly wasn't, as the trade roads expanded and merchants discovered that the river bend was a natural stopping point between the mountains and the coast. It had a permanent population of maybe 3,000, swelled to 6,000 or 7,000 during market season, with a permanent market quarter, an in-district, a craftsman's row, and the particular chaos of a town that was outgrowing its own plans. The cultivation project was being run by a woman named Dessa Whithorn, a botanist from the Southern University who had come to the Ashvale region specifically to study mountain fungi and had, along the way, convinced the Bracewater Town Council to fund a commercial cultivation operation. She was human, 50-ish, with cropped gray hair and the permanently distracted expression of someone who was always thinking about 4 things simultaneously. She hired Grukkar on the spot. You know stone blooms? She said, looking up from his letter of introduction. Grown them my whole life, he said. Can you teach others? If they're willing to learn. Half of them aren't. The other half are willing, but know nothing. Can you work with that? Yes, he said, because it was true. He had spent years working with soil that didn't want to grow anything and coaxing it anyway. Good, Dessa said. You start tomorrow. Lodging is in the worker's house on Canal Street. Dinner's at the common table, 6 o'clock. The work was good. Good in the simple, physical way that Grukkar had always found steadying. Digging, measuring, building the growing frames, preparing the substrate beds, inoculating the first batches, and then watching, patient as stone, for the first signs of growth. The other workers were a mix. 2 young orc men from the southern clans who were loud and good-humored and initially treated Grukkar with the slight wariness reserved for elders they hadn't assessed yet. A middle-aged human woman named Pell who had grown up farming and transferred her competence across species lines without hesitation, and 3 human men of varying ages and varying levels of usefulness. Grukkar settled into it. He taught what he knew. He ate dinner at the common table. He slept in his narrow bed at the worker's house and woke before dawn because he always had. He was, in a careful way, beginning to feel slightly less like a cave. It was in his 3rd week in Bracewater that he first saw Aldric Hane. Aldric Hane was not a remarkable-looking man. He was human, somewhere in his 50s, with the kind of face that seemed designed for a smaller and quieter life than the one he appeared to be living. Medium height, slightly rounded at the shoulders, with brown hair going silver at the temples and a beard that he maintained with the irregular attention of someone who had other things to think about. His hands were a craftsman's hands, scarred, calloused, permanently stained in the creases with what turned out to be woodworking resin. He built furniture. Chairs, mostly. Dining tables. The occasional bed frame. He had a small workshop on the east side of Bracewater, a sign above the door that said Hane's Woodcraft in plain painted letters, and a reputation among the townsfolk for making things that lasted. He also had, as Grukkar discovered, an unsettling habit of sitting on the bench outside his workshop in the early morning and watching the world with an expression of mild, attentive sorrow, the look of a man who had lost something significant and had not yet decided what to do about it. Grukkar knew that expression. He had worn it himself for 6 years. Their first actual meeting was not planned. It happened at the canal side market, where Grukkar was buying supplies for the cultivation project, specific types of substrate material, inoculation tools, and Aldric was buying lumber from a vendor 2 stalls over. They ended up standing next to each other at the payment queue, which was long because the queue keeper was having a slow morning. Aldric looked at Grukkar's basket of supplies with the frank curiosity of a craftsman who instinctively wanted to know what everything was for. Mushroom growing, he said. Yes, Grukkar said. He waited for the flicker of unease that most humans showed in initial conversation with an orc, the moment of recalculation, the careful repositioning of body language away from a threat they weren't entirely sure was real. Aldric didn't do any of that. He looked at the basket, looked at Grukkar's face, and said, "The cultivation project on Millrace Lane? That's the one. I built the shelving units they're using in there," Aldric said. Dessa Whithorn commissioned them back in the spring. Good woman. Knows exactly what she wants, which makes the job easy. The shelving is solid, Grukkar said, because he'd noticed it, the way a craftsman notices another craftsman's work. Good joints. Aldric looked pleased, in the understated way of men who don't expect compliments but are glad of them when they come. Thank you, he said. I'm Aldric. Aldric Hane. Grukkar Stoneback. They shook hands, Grukkar's enormous gray-green hand engulfing Aldric's brown one, and the queue moved forward, and that was that. They ran into each other again 3 days later. Then again a week after that. Bracewater was a market town, but it was not a large one, and the north end of Canal Street, where the worker's house stood, was 3 minutes' walk from Aldric's workshop on the east side, which meant their morning routines occasionally overlapped at the corner bakery, where both of them bought bread. Grukkar was not a man who made friends easily. He was not unfriendly. He simply didn't see the need to force familiarity. But something about Aldric was easy, in the same way that a well-built chair is easy. It just fits, without demanding anything from you. The bread buying became, over a series of mornings, a brief conversation. Became, over further mornings, a longer one. Became, eventually, The thing Grukkar found himself mildly looking forward to. The 10 or 15 minutes of talking with this quiet human man before the day's work began, while the bread was warm in his hands, and the autumn light came across the canal in long, pale strips. He learned things about Aldric gradually, the way you learn a landscape by walking through it. Not all at once, not from a map, but piece by piece, through repeated encounter. Aldric had grown up in Bracewater. His father had been a woodworker and his father's father before that, and the workshop was the same building it had always been, extended twice over the generations. He had married at 28, a woman named Cora who had taught children to read at the local schoolhouse and had opinions about everything and had been, by every account Aldric gave, the most fully alive person he had ever met. She had died 4 years ago, a fever that moved too fast. "I have a daughter," Aldric said one morning, not entirely out of nowhere. They had been talking about Misha and Doric, Grukkar's children, and the conversation had found its own logic. "Tavi. She's 12. She lives with me. Just the two of you. Just the two of us." A pause. She's good. She's better than I deserve, probably. Kids usually are." Grukkar thought about Misha and Doric at 12, the particular ferocity of that age, the way they had needed him to be present even when he was barely managing it. "They need a lot," he said. "Not critically, just as a fact. They need everything," Aldric said. He said it with the exhausted tenderness of a man who was giving everything he had and wasn't sure it was enough. "She's like her mother. Talks to everybody. Has opinions about things I'd never thought to have opinions about. Last week she told me the chairs I make would be better if the backs were slightly higher. She's 12. She's probably right." Grukkar almost smiled. "My daughter told me my mushroom growing method was inefficient when she was 10. She was right too." "What did you do?" "Change the method." Aldric looked at him. "Smart man. Sensible man," Grukkar corrected. Smarter would have been listening the first time. Tavi Hane appeared in Grukkar's awareness gradually, in the way children do when they have decided that an adult in their vicinity is interesting enough to investigate. He first properly noticed her on a Saturday morning when he was at the workshop buying a replacement tool handle. He'd snapped the old one, and Aldric was trying to work at his bench while simultaneously having a quiet argument with a 12-year-old who had clearly just arrived at the age of knowing exactly what she thought about everything. Tavi was small for 12, or at least she seemed small until she started talking, at which point she expanded to fill more space than seemed physically possible. She had her father's brown eyes, and what Grukkar guessed had been her mother's relentless curiosity. Her hair was in 2 braids that she appeared to have done herself, imperfectly but confidently, in the manner of a child who had decided competence mattered more than perfection. She looked at Grukkar without any of the hesitation he expected. "You're the mushroom man," she said. "I am," Grukkar said. "Papa says you know more about mushrooms than anyone he's met. Are there poisonous ones in the project? Can you tell the difference just by looking, or do you have to test them?" "Tavi," Aldric said, with the tone of a father who had had this conversation about not overwhelming people before. "It's fine," Grukkar said. Because it was. Because there was something refreshing about being talked to without the long calculation of whether he was dangerous. "Yes, there are some poisonous varieties in the local hills. Yes, I can tell the difference by looking, usually. Sometimes you have to test. The telltale signs are usually in the gills and the stem base." Tavi's eyes went sharp with interest. "What are the gills?" He explained. She listened with the complete, solemn attention that some children deploy when they've decided something is genuinely worth understanding. Then she asked 3 follow-up questions, each one arising naturally from the last, and Grukkar answered all of them, and Aldric stood at his workbench in the background with the expression of a man watching something happen that he hadn't expected. When Grukkar left, tool handle in hand, Tavi called after him. "Can I see the cultivation project sometime?" "If your father brings you," Grukkar said. She immediately turned to Aldric. "Papa." Aldric looked at Grukkar with a helpless sort of amusement. "Apparently we're coming to see the cultivation project," he said. They came the following Thursday, Aldric and Tavi, and Grukkar showed them through the growing rooms. The climate-controlled chambers where the stone blooms were beginning to pin, the pale heads just emerging from the dark substrate, the air humid and earthy and somehow alive. He explained the process: inoculation, colonization, fruiting conditions, harvest timing. He let Tavi ask all her questions, which were numerous and surprisingly technical for someone her age. Dessa Whithorn wandered in at one point, saw a 12-year-old interrogating her senior mushroom cultivator, and stood in the doorway with a pleased expression that she didn't bother hiding. "You have good instincts," Dessa told Tavi. "You ask the right questions. Most adults don't." Tavi visibly filed this compliment away as a permanent personal asset. On the way out, while Tavi was asking Pell about substrate composition, Aldric walked beside Grukkar and said, quietly, "She hasn't been that interested in something for months." "She's a curious person," Grukkar said. "She is. She used to be." A small pause. "Cora used to take her to the university library every month. Big trips. They'd spend the whole day. Since Cora died, Tavi's had the curiosity, but not the outlet for it, I suppose. I take her when I can, but I don't know enough to feed what she wants to know." Grukkar thought about that. About Doric, at 12, hungry for a world that Stonefang couldn't provide, and Grukkar not knowing how to give him what he needed. "That's hard," he said, "watching them want something you can't give them." "Yes," Aldrich said, simply. They walked in silence for a moment. "She can come back," Grukkar said, "if she wants. There's always something to do in the growing rooms. I can use the help, and I can answer the questions." Aldrich looked at him. Something complicated moved through his expression, gratitude, but also the caution of a man who had learned not to rely on things. "I don't want to impose," he said. "You're not imposing," Grukkar said. "I'm offering." 2 weeks later, everything that had been building in Grukkar collapsed. It happened the way collapses often do, not from one cause, but from the accumulated weight of many, all arriving simultaneously. He received a letter from Doric that was warm and busy and contained, buried in the third paragraph, the news that Doric had met someone, was thinking of settling in the city permanently, might not be back to the mountains next spring as he'd planned. He received another letter from Marek, his old healer, that mentioned casually and in passing that she was not feeling her best lately, that her joints were bad, that winter was coming early. He also, on the same day, walked past the canal in the wrong light at the wrong angle and saw, for just a second, something in the way the evening hit the water that looked exactly like the particular quality of light in the kitchen window of his house in Stonefang. The light that Vrenna had always loved, the light she used to sit in to braid copper wire into her hair. He was fine until he was not. He made it back to the worker's house and sat on the edge of his bed and did not move for a very long time. The grief was not new. It was years old, but grief is not like most things. It does not diminish in a straight line. It has topography, long flat stretches where you can travel easily, and then sudden drops, sudden descents into the original depth, where nothing is old or managed or past. It is as new as the first moment, every time. He sat. He breathed. He thought about Vrenna and about Doric going away and about Marek's joints and about the 6 years he had spent being alive without being present and about the house in Stonefang that would be empty when he returned to it in the spring and the mushroom garden that didn't grow quite right without Vrenna's hands. And all of it was just weight. Not dramatic, not despairing. Just heavy in the particular way that certain kinds of loss is heavy, like stone that has been pressing on you so long. You forget it's there until it shifts, and you feel the full mass of it all at once. He didn't notice the knock at the front door of the worker's house. He barely noticed when someone, Pell, the farmer woman, came to his room and said that there was a man at the door asking for him. Aldric was standing on the front step with a covered pot in his hands. He looked at Grukkar, at the state of Grukkar, which was visible to anyone paying attention, the stillness, the pallor, the eyes that weren't quite focused, and he didn't say anything for a moment. He just held the pot. "I was making stew," he said finally. "Tavi suggested I bring some. She says you work too much and probably don't eat properly." Grukkar stared at him. He didn't have words immediately available. "It's lentil and root vegetable," Aldric continued, in the steady, matter-of-fact voice of a man who had learned how to be practical in the presence of pain. "Nothing complicated. Tavi made the bread to go with it. It's mostly edible. You didn't have to. I know I didn't have to." Aldric's voice was even, careful. "Can I come in?" They sat in the small common room of the worker's house. Empty at that hour, everyone else still at work or in the market, and ate lentil stew and Tavi's mostly edible bread, which was dense and slightly underseasoned, but had been made with obvious effort and care. Grukkar ate. He hadn't realized until the food was in front of him that he'd missed lunch, and possibly breakfast. They didn't talk for a while. Aldric seemed to understand that talking was not what was needed first. He just sat there, solid and unhurried, eating his own bowl with the patient equanimity of a man who had learned to exist in difficult silences without trying to fill them. Eventually, Grukkar said, "My wife died 6 years ago." "I know," Aldric said. "You mentioned her. Vrenna. I got letters today. My son is staying in the city. My old healer is sick." He paused. "It's not. I know it's not the same as losing them. It's all the same thing," Aldric said. Not unkindly, just clearly. It's the same thing hitting different notes. Grukkar looked at him. "When Cora died," Aldric said, looking at his bowl, "I thought it would get easier in a straight line. Less each month. Less each year. It doesn't work like that. It gets easier in the flat parts, and then something small, the wrong light, a particular smell, a letter that says someone is moving away, and you're back at the start. Back in the first week of it." He paused. "I used to think that meant I wasn't healing. It took me a long time to understand that it just means you loved someone, and loving someone doesn't have an end point." Grukkar was quiet. "Loving someone doesn't have an end point," he repeated, slowly. "No," Aldric said. "It doesn't. And that's not a flaw in you. It's the size of the thing." Grukkar did not become a different person after that evening. He would have been suspicious of any story that claimed otherwise. But something shifted. Something that had been locked. Not dramatically, not with any great click or visible mechanism, but quietly, in the way that ice shifts when it begins to thaw. Barely perceptible movement, in what had seemed permanently fixed, began, slowly, to unlock. He started eating dinner with Aldric and Tavi on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Not every night. He was careful about that, careful not to become dependent, careful about the boundary between welcome and intrusion. But the Tuesday through Thursday arrangement established itself naturally, without anyone formally declaring it, in the way that habits between people who like each other tend to establish themselves. Tavi, true to form, treated him as a permanent fixture from approximately their third dinner together, with the pragmatic acceptance of a child who had decided he was useful and interesting and therefore clearly belonged. She showed him her collection of pressed plants, 47 specimens, carefully labeled in her cramped handwriting, mounted on parchment sheets and bound in a leather folder. He told her which ones were related to fungi and why, which led to a 40-minute conversation about the difference between plants and fungi that Aldric occasionally contributed to while carving a chair leg at the far end of the room. Grukkar brought her stone blooms from the cultivation project, not the cultivated ones, but wild samples he found on his weekly walks in the hills above Bracewater, different varieties, the ones he could identify as safe. She added them to her collection. He taught Aldric, one evening, how to identify the 5 most common edible mushrooms in the Ashvale region and the 4 most dangerous ones that resembled them. Aldric paid close attention, asked practical questions, and remembered everything on first hearing, which was the mark of a mind that worked precisely, even if it didn't announce itself. And they talked, not in the way of people trying to fill silence, but in the way of people who had each been alone too long with their own thoughts and found, in each other's company, that the thoughts were easier to examine when shared. Aldric told him about Cora, not the loss of her, but the life of her, the way she had read 3 books simultaneously because one was never enough, the way she had argued with the town council about school funding with a ferocity that had terrified and delighted everyone present, the way she had burned every single thing she ever cooked and felt no shame about it whatsoever. He told these stories not with grief, but with the particular pleasure of a person who has loved someone and wants the world to know it, and Grukkar listened to all of it and felt something unlock a little further. Grukkar told him about Vrenna, about the copper wire braids, about the laugh like a rockslide, about the way she had been right about the mushroom method when Misha was 10 and had been too kind to say so outright, leaving the discovery to him, about the morning she died, when the sky was unfairly blue. Aldric listened. He did not say any of the things people usually said, the things about time and peace, and she would have wanted you to be happy. He just listened and nodded, and when Grukkar stopped, he said, "She sounds like she was magnificent." She was, Grukkar said. She really was. The first real crisis came in November, when a cold snap settled over Bracewater earlier than expected, and the canal froze 3 weeks before its normal time. Grukkar, walking back from the cultivation site in the early dark, slipped on a patch of ice at the corner of Canal and Millrace streets, and came down hard on his left knee and his right hand, both simultaneously, and lay on the frozen ground for a moment trying to assess whether anything was broken. Nothing was broken, but his knee was badly wrenched, the hand was cut, and the walk back to the worker's house was going to be painful. He was doing a careful, slow job of getting himself upright when he became aware that someone was running toward him, their boots skidding slightly on the same ice patch that had taken him down. It was Aldric, coming from the direction of the workshop, still in his woodworking apron. "I saw you from the window," he said, reaching Grukkar's side and crouching next to him with the immediate, practical focus of someone who didn't panic. "Stay still. What's hurt?" "Knee," Grukkar said. "Hand." "Dignity." 2 out of 3 I can help with," Aldric said. He assessed the cut hand, pulled a clean cloth from his apron pocket. He was the kind of man who had clean cloths in his pockets, which was the kind of man Grukkar had come to understand he was, and wrapped it efficiently. Then he helped Grukkar up, taking more of the weight than his smaller frame should have been able to manage, and walked him, slowly, to the workshop. Tavi was there. She looked at Grukkar's limp, assessed the situation, and immediately went to get the kit her father kept for workshop injuries. They cleaned the hand properly, wrapped the knee, sat Grukkar in the chair nearest the workshop's central heating stone, and gave him tea. "You should stay tonight," Aldric said. "The knee needs to be off the ground. The workers' house beds are too low." "I'll be fine," Grukkar said, because he always said he would be fine. "You will be fine," Aldric agreed. "Faster, from the spare room here. Tavi, will you make up the bed?" "Already going," Tavi called from the back of the house. Grukkar looked at Aldric. "You don't have to do this," he said. The same thing he had said months ago, at the worker's house door. The reflexive, careful protest of a man who had spent years not asking for anything. "I know I don't have to," Aldric said, in exactly the same tone as before. "You're not imposing. I'm offering." A small, quiet pause. "You told me that once." Grukkar looked at him for a moment. "I did," he said. "So stop arguing and drink your tea," Aldric said. "It's cold and you're gray." Grukkar stayed for 3 days. His knee was worse than he'd initially assessed. Not broken, but a ligament strain that Dessa Whithorn, who had some medical training, confirmed needed rest. He directed the cultivation project from Aldric's kitchen table via notes that Pell carried back and forth, which Pell did with the good-natured competence of someone who was used to solving practical problems. Those 3 days were, he realized later, the days when everything became clear. Not dramatic clarity, not a revelation, just the slow, steady realization of something that had been true for a while and simply hadn't been acknowledged yet. He was not alone in this house. He was not a guest, exactly. He was something between a guest and a fixture, something without a precise word, something that fit. Tavi brought him books from her room to read. Confident, proprietary, as if she had decided his taste in reading and was curating accordingly. Aldric cooked without making an event of it, setting down plates of food with the same matter-of-fact care with which he built furniture, solid, reliable, without unnecessary flourish. And there were sounds. The sound of a workshop running. The sound of a child doing homework at the kitchen table, occasionally complaining about it. The sound of 2 people who loved each other in the particular comfortable way of parents and children who had weathered something hard and come through it together, still intact. Grukkar had not been in a house with these sounds for 6 years. He had not known, until he was inside them again, how much he had missed them. On the second evening, when Tavi had gone to bed and the house was quiet, he sat with Aldric by the workshop stove, both of them with cups of the dark bitter tea that Aldric made, which tasted terrible and was somehow comforting anyway. The fire burned down slowly. Outside, the canal ice creaked in the cold. "I've been thinking," Aldric said. "About what?" Grukkar said. "About the spring. When the project ends." A pause. He was looking at the fire, not at Grukkar, which was the way Aldric approached things he found difficult. Sideways, carefully, not head-on. "You'll go back to the mountains." "That's the plan," Grukkar said. "Yes." A longer pause. "I've been wondering what Stonefang is like." Grukkar looked at him. "Why?" Aldric was quiet for a moment. "Tavi hasn't been to the mountains. She's been asking about them since you told her about the stone blooms growing wild in the highland passes." A pause. "And he stopped. "You what?" Grukkar said quietly. Aldric finally looked at him. "I've been thinking that Bracewater is a good place," he said. and I've been thinking that it might not be the only good place." He said it carefully, as if placing each word where it wouldn't break something. Grukkar looked at him for a long time. He thought about the house in Stonefang, empty since Misha had left, the 2 bedrooms that nobody slept in, the mushroom garden that needed someone with particular attention and particular hands, the mountains, which were beautiful in a way he had stopped seeing, because you stop seeing what's always there until someone new arrives to see it with you. He thought about what Marek had said, go somewhere that isn't inside your own head, and how perhaps she had meant more than one thing by it. "It's cold," he said finally. "In the winter. Colder than here. And the road is 2 days' walk." "I know," Aldric said. "Tavi would need winter clothes. Proper ones. Not lowland clothes. I can make that work." "The house has room," Grukkar said. Slowly, carefully, if you were to visit, or to see it, before deciding anything. "Yes," Aldric said. A long, warm silence. "Yes," Grukkar said. The project ended in late February, 2 weeks ahead of schedule, because the stoneblooms had colonized the substrate faster than projected, a fact that Dessa Whithorn documented with academic glee, and that Grukkar accepted with the modest satisfaction of a man who knows his work. He went back to Stonefang in the first week of March, when the snow was still on the ground, but the light had changed, the particular quality of late winter light. That means the season is turning even before the temperatures admit it. He opened his house. He built his fires. He walked through the mushroom garden and assessed what needed doing. And then, 3 weeks later, a cart came up the mountain road with a woodworker and his daughter and enough baggage for an extended stay. Tavi arrived like a force of nature, in a very good coat that Aldric had commissioned from a local tailor specifically for the mountain winter, with her plant collection carefully packed in a leather case and 1,000 questions about the stone blooms she could already see growing wild on the hillsides. Aldric arrived more quietly, standing in the road looking at the mountains for a long moment before he looked at the house, and then at Grukkar, with an expression that was something between arrival and relief. "It's beautiful," he said, not the flattering remark of a visitor, the genuine response of a person who had been somewhere that fit. "It is," Grukkar agreed. He had stopped not seeing it. They stayed through the spring, then through the summer. Aldric wrote to his clients in Bracewater, made arrangements, found a young carpenter he trusted to manage the workshop through the next season. Tavi wrote to her school and arranged continued studies through correspondence, which her teacher, who had always found Tavi extraordinary and slightly exhausting, agreed to with something like relief. The mushroom garden, that second spring, grew better than it had in years. Grukkar noticed it first in the 3rd week of April, the stone blooms coming up fatter, more vigorous, the caps a deeper, richer color than he'd seen in seasons. He stood in the garden in the morning light and couldn't account for it, couldn't point to any single change in method or condition. Then he realized the garden wasn't different. He was paying attention again, really paying attention, present in the way he hadn't been in 6 years, awake to the variations in soil moisture and substrate temperature, and the particular angle of morning light that the stone blooms preferred. He was there, fully, in a way that Vrenna had been and that the garden had missed. It turned out that mushrooms, like most living things, grew better when someone was truly paying attention. Marek came down from her cottage to meet Aldric and Tavi on a Tuesday in May. She was moving slower with her joints, but her eyes were as sharp as ever, and she assessed Aldric with the comprehensive efficiency of a woman who had been reading people for 70 years and was not going to pretend she wasn't. She said, after about 3 minutes of conversation. "Itchem what?" Grukkar said. "Nothing," Marek said, with the tone of a woman for whom meant everything I hoped. She took Tavi on a walk up the hill to show her where the wild stone blooms grew thickest, and the 2 of them were gone for 2 hours and came back with a basket of specimens and what appeared to be the beginning of a formidable friendship. "That child is extraordinary," Marek told Grukkar that evening. "Yes," he said. "She is. And her father is." "Yes," Grukkar said again, before she could finish. Marek looked at him. Her ancient face arranged itself into something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. "Good," she said. "You've had enough time being a cave." In the last week of summer, Misha came home for a visit with her husband and her daughter, Grukkar's granddaughter, 3 years old, named Vrenna, which had been Misha's idea and had caused Grukkar to sit down abruptly and not speak for several minutes when he first heard it. She arrived to find her father's house full of people, full of noise. full of the particular warm chaos of a home that has remembered what it is for. She stood in the doorway and looked at Grukkar, who was at the table helping small Vrenna inspect a collection of pressed mushrooms that Tavi had assembled for exactly this purpose. Across the room, Aldric was measuring the kitchen window frame. He had been quietly, systematically fixing everything in the house that needed fixing, with the focused contentment of a craftsman given good material and time. While Tavi sat at the table with a stack of correspondence papers and corrected her mathematics homework with an expression of intense personal grievance. Misha looked at all of it. Then she looked at her father. Something in his face, something she had been looking for, without knowing she was looking for it, for 6 years, was there. The coals had caught. The fire was back. She crossed the room and hugged him, which required her to stretch significantly, since he was considerably larger than her, and he hugged her back, solid and present, his enormous arms around her in the way she remembered from childhood, when she had believed, with the perfect confidence of small things, that nothing could reach her when he was holding on. "Papa," she said. "Misha," he said. No more words were needed. Little Vrenna, unaware that she had a name to live up to, picked up a stonebloom cap from the collection, examined it with the round-eyed seriousness of a 3-year-old encountering something new, and looked up at Grukkar. "What this?" she said. "A stonebloom," he said. "Why gray?" "Because gray things grow in the dark," he said. "And then they come out into the light, and they're beautiful." She considered this with the full weight of her 3-year-old judgment. "Okay," she said, and put it carefully back. Outside, the mountain stood as it always had, patient, enormous, indifferent to the small, particular griefs of the creatures on its slopes. But inside the stone house, in the warm press of voices and the smell of bread and wood resin and mushroom earth, something lived that the mountain, for all its age, could not contain. The stubborn, improbable insistence of people who have lost everything finding, in each other, a reason to begin again.